There are prophecies in MotoGP that are not spoken like predictions but live like open wounds, and Dani Pedrosa carries one carved into his silence. First you lose the setup, then the team, and finally yourself. In 2013, he watched Marc Márquez arrive at Honda and in 2 weeks turn a world carefully engineered for his precision into a playground of chaos, and now Pecco Bagnaia stands at that same precipice, his Ducati GP25 trembling between loyalty and betrayal. The very motorcycle that crowned him world champion twice, an instrument tuned to his millimetric sensitivity, has begun to sing a different song in Marquez's hands, and each note cuts like a blade. Telemetry, ruthless as a judge, shows Marquez entering corners faster, pivoting with a rear brake like a sculptor carving time, while Pecco's once fluid strokes fracture into angles, his style unraveling curve by curve. What is at stake is more than seconds or titles. It is identity, the sacred intimacy between rider and machine, the fragile illusion that the bike belongs only to one man's hands. Marquez thrives in instability, bending disorder into speed, while Pecco searches desperately for the lost harmony of balance and control, whispering inside his helmet, "Why doesn't it listen to me anymore?" The garage itself tilts under the gravity of a new star, engineers drawn toward the data that glows greener on the screens, while Bagnaia feels like a guest in the very fortress that once bore his crown. It is here that Pedrosa's teachings return, not as nostalgia but as warning. Marc does not merely take victories, he rewrites reality, reshapes the air of a team, and corrodes the certainty of those who resist him. This is the storm Bagnaia now faces, a duel not only of speed but of existence, where adaptation risks erasing his essence, and resistance risks condemning him to irrelevance. And yet, beneath the weight of history, one spark remains, the will to fight back, to bend without breaking, to carve his own path in the shadow of a man who bends reality itself. And so the first chapter of this unfolding drama begins with Pedrosa's prophecy itself, a warning carved in 2013 that now returns like an echo in Bagnaia's heart. First you lose the setup, then the team, and finally yourself. In the fluorescent silence of a MotoGP garage, history often hides its sharpest lessons beneath the hum of generators, and no one understood that better than Dani Pedrosa, who in 2013 watched his Honda RC 213V, built to magnify his meticulous sensitivity, become the stage for a revolution authored by Marc Márquez, a rider who dismantled hierarchies as if they were made of glass, not steel. Pedrosa, always a surgeon of precision, had seen his world turned upside down in 2 weeks, and from that experience emerged a warning sharpened by pain. First you lose the setup, then the team, and finally yourself. Bagnaia knows these words by heart now, though he never asked for them. And in the quiet of his visor, he whispers to himself, "What if the prophecy is already mine, written curve by curve before I even touch the throttle?" The engineers, armed with data sheets thicker than novels, know that even a single millimeter in fork offset can dictate whether a corner whispers stability or screams chaos, and that is precisely where Pecco feels the echo of Dani's past pressing against his chest. Pedrosa's lesson was not about numbers but about erosion, the way authority drains from a rider not with crashes or defeats, but with a subtle shifting of glances inside a garage that no longer orbits around you. The prophecy is not carved in marble. It is written in telemetry, in the hesitation of mechanics when choosing which feedback to privilege, and Pecco senses it like a drop of oil spreading on white paper. Marquez once embodied the storm that tore Dani's control away, and now he enters Ducati not as a guest but as a gravitational force capable of bending the GP25's destiny to his chaotic style. For Pecco, the prophecy is not a memory but a mirror, and each reflection is harder to face. A metaphor rises unbidden. His role is like a violinist who suddenly realizes the instrument responds better to another's bow, and every note he draws feels slightly out of tune. The garage air tastes metallic, infused with brake dust and suppressed tension, and the sound of the torque wrenches becomes more accusatory than supportive. Reporters speak of technical comparisons, but beneath their headlines lurks the same old story, one Dani had already narrated with his silence more than his voice. Bagnaia looks at the GP25 and wonders if it is betraying him, or if he is betraying himself by trying to control what Marquez rides freely. The prophecy feels heavy because it is not just about losing seconds on track. It is about losing the intimacy with a machine that once felt like an extension of breath and bone. Dani had once confessed to close friends that the most painful moment was not defeat but realizing the bike no longer answered his hands the way it once had, and Pecco trembles at the thought of feeling the same fracture. There is a terrible intimacy in the prophecy, because it does not scream. It whispers until you can't tell if the voice is yours or someone else's. He closes his eyes and tries to remember what pure confidence feels like, but the image flickers. interrupted by Marquez's shadow cutting across the pit lane. The prophecy of Dani Pedrosa is not folklore. It is a mechanism repeating itself, precise as a camshaft rotation, inevitable as the closing of a throttle before a blind curve. Bagnaia breathes in, shallow and tense, as though inhaling the dust of someone else's tragedy. Every rider wants to believe they control their destiny, yet Pecco feels that control leaking through his gloves like sand escaping a clenched fist. The climax arrives not with thunder, but with a whisper, when the words engraved in memory strike again. First you lose the setup, then the team, and finally yourself. And as Pecco lowers his head toward the digital readout glowing in the garage light, he understands that the prophecy has already begun. The Ducati GP25 was born as a machine of surgical intention, designed around Pecco Bagnaia's taste for millimetric balance, a bike that requires harmony between chassis stiffness, tire carcass temperature, and the most subtle mapping of engine braking, and yet in the hands of Marc Márquez it has become something else entirely, something unpredictable, alive, a creature that bends to chaos rather than control. Pedrosa once warned with chilling simplicity, Pecco has to have the bike exactly as he wants it. Marc can change the settings and still lap at the same pace. Those words cut deeper now, because Bagnaia's very identity is tied to repetition, the order of perfect laps where throttle opening and lean angle align like constellations, while Marquez throws himself into corners as if the rules of physics were suggestions rather than limits. The little-known truth is that the GP25 swing arm flex was adjusted mid-season by 0.2 of a millimeter to give Pecco a softer feedback on exit, but Marc instantly demanded the opposite, more rigidity, more reaction, and still produced the same lap time. Bagnaia, staring at the data, whispers inside his helmet. Why does the same machine speak to him in a language I can't understand? For Pecco, each lap must be written like a sentence with grammar and order, while Marquez scribbles like a poet in a storm, messy but unforgettable. The Ducati engineers study telemetry curves, but they already know what Pedrosa revealed years ago. Marc is capable of riding in the middle of confusion. For him, limit and willpower are enough to make the difference, even with a bike that doesn't talk to him. The metaphor is cruel but exact. Pecco plays the GP25 like a pianist who demands every key in tune, while Marc hammers on the same instrument even when strings snap, producing a melody that still shakes the room. On track, this difference manifests in subtle brutalities. Marquez braking 5 meters later into turn 7, trusting the front vibration like a friend, while Bagnaia rolls off earlier, desperate for stability that never quite arrives. One style builds predictability, the other feeds off risk, and the paradox is that the Ducati, meant to reward precision, seems to blossom in the hands of instability. Mechanics talk quietly in the back of the garage, noting how Marc can adapt in 3 corners to a new mapping that would take Pecco half a session to test. The clash is not about talent but philosophy. One man engineers perfection before release, the other discovers perfection in imperfection. The paddock feels the tension, watching Bagnaia tighten his gloves like a surgeon about to make an incision, while Marquez pulls his visor down like an actor ready for improvisation. The GP25 trembles under both men, yet it sings a different song depending on the hands of the bars, a cruel reminder that machines are not neutral, they choose their interpreters. Journalists describe the duel in lap times, but the deeper story is written in invisible dialogue between rider and bike, a dialogue Pecco finds scripted and Marc finds improvisational. Bagnaia fears losing not seconds but the intimacy that makes him whole, because for him the GP25 is not a tool but a mirror, and lately the reflection feels fractured. The climax comes in qualifying, when Marquez sets a blistering lap on a setup Bagnaia had discarded the day before, and the garage freezes as the stopwatch declares allegiance. In that instant, Pecco's world tilts, not because of a defeat in numbers, but because the very essence of his connection with the machine feels challenged. The GP25, once designed to echo his heartbeat, now pulses to a rhythm that belongs to someone else, and the only truth left is the silence after the checkered flag. Telemetry does not lie, but sometimes its truth is crueler than words, a collection of lines and colors that tell the story of 2 riders separated not by horsepower but by philosophy. And in those graphs Marc Márquez always enters the corner faster, always extracts tense from the transitions, always exploits the rear brake like a sculptor chiseling stone, turning instability into an ally. The engineers trace red against blue, showing Bagnaia the half-deci gained in the chicane, where Marquez dares to leave the bike unsettled, and Pecco feels the sting in his chest more than in his stopwatch. Every time I found something, Marc was fast with the opposite, Pedrosa once confessed, and the words feel like a dagger sharpened by history itself. Bagnaia sits with arms crossed, whispering inside his helmet. How can I fight a man who thrives in the very disorder that unravels me? The technical detail hides in the telemetry. Marquez maintains throttle overlap during trail braking at 3% longer than Bagnaia, destabilizing the chassis but reducing rotation time, a micro-adjustment invisible to the eye but devastating on the clock. The metaphor is inevitable. Pecco draws with a compass, Marquez with a storm cloud, and somehow the cloud sketches faster. Journalists frame it as a duel of styles, yet for the men inside the garage it feels like a duel of identities, because each curve reflects not only a technique but a soul. Marquez brakes later, trusting a vibrating front tire like a gambler trusts dice, while Bagnaia begs for a stillness that never arrives. Each instability is a fracture in Pecco's confidence, a voice telling him that his once perfect dance has become a stumble. Engineers murmur, their loyalty swaying toward the side of the garage where risk translates into lap times. Pedrosa knew it before anyone else. Data could crush more than crashes, because it shows your truth in digits you cannot deny. In debriefs, the lines stretch across screens like seismic waves, and every peak screams marks freedom against Pecco's constraint. Even a tenth lost in transition corners echoes louder than a second on straights, because it reveals whose style bends the bike and whose style breaks upon it. Pecco lifts his visor, eyes fixed on the numbers, but what he sees is not just data. It is the erosion of identity. Marquez's aggressiveness with the rear brake becomes a signature, a fingerprint of dominance written on asphalt, while Bagnaia's restraint becomes a liability disguised as elegance. The climax arrives when the engineers confirm what Pecco already fears. Even with identical setups, Marquez gains time simply by existing differently on the bike. And in that moment, Pecco realizes the cruelest truth of all, that telemetry is not just measurement but judgment. There is a kind of silence inside a MotoGP garage that speaks louder than the engines, and lately that silence has grown thick on Bagnaia's side. The same frost Dani Pedrosa once felt at HRC when glances turned colder, mechanics hesitated, and hierarchy slipped silently from his hands, a frost now creeping into Ducati's House of Red. Gigi Dall'Igna's smile, once a banner of reassurance for Pecco, now drifts almost instinctively toward Marquez's corner, a subtle gesture more cutting than any lap time. Pedrosa's memory returns like a ghostly echo. When he arrived at Honda, he turned the garage upside down in 2 weeks. Bagnaia lowers his gaze to the floor tiles painted in scarlet, whispering in his mind, "Why do I feel like a guest in the team that once crowned me king?" The little-known truth is that Ducati has already reallocated a data analyst to Marc's crew, a quiet reshuffle that no one admits but everyone notices, an invisible realignment of resources. It is not betrayal, but the logic of results, and it burns sharper than betrayal itself. The metaphor rises naturally. The garage feels like a house where 2 pianos play at once, and everyone leans toward the instrument that produces music even when strings snap. Technicians move with rehearsed efficiency, yet Pecco senses hesitation in their nods, the way approval lingers longer when Marquez speaks. The chatter of torque wrenches, once a comfort, now sounds like a verdict passed behind his back. In debriefs, his words float but do not land, while Marc's observations fall like commands disguised as suggestions. Pedrosa once endured that erosion of authority, the slow theft of centrality that no rider ever admits aloud but every rider fears. Ducati is not divided by malice but by gravity, and Marc is a black hole swallowing attention, trust, and narrative. The frost is not a sudden freeze but a creeping cold that seeps into cracks already formed by Bagnaia's doubt. Pecco senses the warmth draining from his corner of the garage, a warmth once built on victories now fading into memory. Journalists notice it too, remarking not on lap times but on body language, smiles, and the absence of laughter near his chair. Every rider knows the garage is as much battlefield as racetrack, and in this theater Marc has already shifted the spotlight. Pedrosa's prophecy materializes in the subtle weight of silence, in the engineers who stay a beat longer near number 93's bike. The climax comes not with words but with gestures, when Pecco catches his crew chief exchanging a quick smile with Marc after a debrief, a smile that once belonged to him. And in that instant, he feels the fortress of Bologna tilt, its banners still red, but its loyalty quietly leaning toward another king. Bagnaia's writing, once fluid as ink poured across paper, has grown fractured, angular, almost brittle, a style that no longer breathes with the natural cadence of confidence, but staggers like a melody played on strings too tight, and each lap deepens the fracture between rider and machine. The GP25, the very motorcycle that crowned him twice, now feels like an imposter in familiar clothing, unstable on corner entry, nervous on exit, unfaithful in mid-turn, as though it has forgotten the language they once shared. Pedrosa had captured this prison with cruel accuracy. Marc has this ability to convince the bike to follow him, even if it doesn't want to. Bagnaia leans over telemetry charts and whispers silently inside his helmet. Why doesn't it listen to me anymore? The technical truth is microscopic yet lethal. His preferred rear ride height device setting of -2 millimeters no longer stabilizes the bike, while Marquez, demanding +1, extracts grip that Pecco cannot find. The metaphor is merciless. Pecco is like a painter suddenly betrayed by colors that dry before they touch the canvas, while Marc splashes wildly and somehow creates a masterpiece. Engineers adjust, recalibrate, promise small gains, but Pecco feels the deeper loss, the erosion of intimacy with a bike that once responded to his smallest breath. In every warm-up, the machine resists him like a partner unwilling to dance, stumbling where it once glided. The crisis is not about points but about essence, about a rider questioning the very foundations of his craft. Journalists murmur of technical issues, but beneath their words lies a narrative of identity slipping through leather-gloved fingers. The screen glows with comparative data, red and green deltas flashing judgment, each green for Marquez, a wound for Bagnaia. Pedrosa's ghostly presence lingers in memory, reminding him that the bike itself may now belong more to Marc than to him. He grips the handlebars harder, searching for reassurance in the vibrations, but the response feels alien, like shaking hands with a stranger. The paddock senses his unease, the way he avoids eye contact, the heaviness in his gait as he leaves debriefs without conviction. Each lap becomes a question rather than an answer, and questions weigh more heavily than mistakes. Pecco once commanded the Ducati with the calm of a conductor. Now every correction fractures the rhythm further. He wonders if adaptation would mean survival or betrayal, whether to remain himself or become someone else entirely. The climax arrives in silence, when he returns to the box and sees mechanics laugh at a joke Marc has made, their joy reflected in a machine that seems to adore one rider while rejecting the other. And in that reflection, Pecco feels the deepest wound, not defeat in numbers, but the terrifying suspicion that he no longer belongs to the bike that once made him whole. Bagnaia once rode with a serenity that made every curve resemble calligraphy, each trajectory an elegant stroke flowing seamlessly from entry to apex. But now his riding has splintered into angular fragments, stripped of harmony, as if the grammar of speed he once mastered had been scrambled into incoherence. The GP25, the very machine that gave him 2 world titles, feels estranged, unstable on braking, nervous through fast corners, and unfaithful when grip vanishes mid-lean, a mechanical body once intimate that now recoils at his touch. Dani Pedrosa foresaw this suffocating trap and named it with chilling lucidity. Marc has this ability to convince the bike to follow him, even if it doesn't want to. Bagnaia lowers his visor before practice and mutters inside the helmet. Why does it resist me, but obey him? Engineers dive into technical details, chasing ghosts through data logs that reveal the cruel truth. Marc tolerates rear chatter peaks above 25 Hz, peaks that force Pecco to roll off, and what for one is opportunity becomes for the other paralysis. The metaphor arrives uninvited. Pecco is like a violinist playing an instrument that now produces echoes instead of notes, while Marquez seizes the same instrument and makes it roar like an orchestra. In warm-up, the imbalance feels visceral. The front folds earlier, the rear kicks wider, corrections multiply, and each correction shatters more the rider's self-belief. Pecco is not losing time alone. He is losing language, a private code once shared with his Ducati. Mechanics reassure him with numbers, but he knows numbers can't translate sensation, can't restore the intimacy that once pulsed through handlebars and seat. Journalists describe it clinically as set-up mismatch, yet inside, it feels like exile, a forced distance from something once sacred. The screen in the box glows with traces, red for Marc, blue for Pecco, and the lines part ways like 2 lives diverging irreparably. Pedrosa's old grief resonates, a caution that identity erodes not suddenly, but curve by curve, until the rider becomes a stranger to himself. Bagnaia clenches his jaw, trying to summon belief, but belief cannot override betrayal, and each lap deepens the estrangement. His posture changes too, less fluid, shoulders tighter, gestures more mechanical, and the body betrays what the mind hides. The paddock senses it in whispers, technicians feel it in half-hearted nods, and even rivals notice the absence of grace where once there was unshakable poise. The crisis extends beyond performance. It cuts into dignity, twisting triumph into doubt. He feels suspended, a man between past and present, titles and uncertainty, precision and chaos. And the climax falls not in a crash or a failure, but in a glance at the GP25 under the fluorescent garage lights, when Bagnaia admits silently that the machine still looks like his, yet rides as if it belongs to someone else. The moment of decision arrives not with fireworks but with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest until even breath feels heavy, and in that stillness Bagnaia recognizes the weight of a crossroads Dani Pedrosa once knew too well. Pedrosa had confessed his deepest regret with words that burn like truth etched in steel. "You still have a choice that I didn't have." For Pecco, the choice is as cruel as it is clear. Adapt and risk losing the essence that made him champion, or resist and risk being reduced to a shadow beside Marc Márquez. Inside the visor, he whispers to himself, "If I change for him, am I still me?" The technical details sharpen the dilemma. Marc thrives on higher front preload values that unsettle stability, while Pecco's setup requires softer balance to unlock the rhythm of precision, and merging those two worlds seems as impossible as blending fire and glass. Yet Marquez's presence forces the reckoning, because this is no longer a story of lap times but of narrative, of who commands the mythos of Ducati in 2025. Pedrosa admitted with a sigh that echoed across time, "Marc has the ability to rewrite reality." The metaphor fits painfully. Pecco is like a poet forced to read verses rewritten by another, while the audience applauds the imposter's cadence. In every press conference, questions tilt toward Marc, and Pecco feels his own answers dissolve before they reach the air. In debriefs, engineers hesitate between fidelity and pragmatism, their pens hovering over setups that echo Marc's instincts rather than Pecco's needs. The crisis becomes a duel between loyalty to self and survival in the collective, a duel fought not on asphalt but inside the trembling line of his confidence. Bagnaia studies Marc's telemetry like a foreign language, syllables of throttle and brake he struggles to pronounce. The pressure mounts in whispers from journalists, who frame him as the defending champion already defending against his own teammate's shadow. His shoulders tighten during warm-ups, a bodily confession of the mental knots constricting him. Dani's warning reverberates in his mind, reminding him that hesitation is itself a choice, one that corrodes faster than failure. Pecco feels the paddock watching not just his results but his transformation, waiting to see whether he bends or breaks. The climax strikes when he finally asks his engineer to load Marc's setup, but with a twist, to adapt it through his own hands, his own rhythm, his own fragile signature. In that decision lies defiance and surrender entwined, paradox that defines greatness. For the first time, Bagnaia chooses not between himself and Marc, but to confront the space where their realities collide. And as the garage hums with the sound of laptops and compressors, he feels the echo of Pedrosa's gaze upon him, silent yet approving, because a rider is never defined by choices avoided, only by the courage to face the impossible. The garage breathes in heavy unison as Bagnaia finally breaks the chain of hesitation, raising his eyes from the telemetry sheets that have mocked him for weeks, and utters the words that feel both surrender and defiance. "Let's try Marc's setup, but adapt it to my hand, not his knee." Engineers exchange glances, uncertain if this is desperation or clarity. Yet for Pecco, it is the first step toward reclaiming authorship of his story. Dani Pedrosa watches from the shadows with a silence born of scars, and then a rare smile forms. The smile of a man who warned, suffered, and endured, now seeing in Pecco the spark that transforms crisis into resistance. Bagnaia closes his visor and murmurs to himself, "This bike will speak my language again, even if I have to invent new words." The technical sheet reveals the gamble, a rear ride height raised by 2 millimeters, a stiffer engine brake map in third gear, and a preload compromise between chaos and symmetry, a setup that is neither Marc's nor Pecco's but hybrid forge and necessity. The metaphor becomes vivid. He is like a sculptor chiseling from another artist's unfinished block, risking fractures yet daring to find his own form within the stone. On track, the first laps wobble, corrections multiply, but the rhythm returns like a heartbeat rediscovered after arrhythmia. Each corner is no longer a reminder of betrayal, but a chance to redraw trust, curve by curve. Journalists sense the shift, noting less the times and more the posture, the shoulders that no longer sag, the throttle hand that no longer trembles. Pedrosa's words echo like a benediction. Choices shape destinies, and this choice has broken the cycle of passive erosion. The GP25, once a stranger, begins to yield glimpses of recognition, as though the machine is testing his resolve before granting back its intimacy. The paddock watches with an air of suspense, unsure if this is rebirth or illusion, but magnetized by the drama of transformation. Pecco knows he is still slower than Marc, yet the difference no longer feels like exile. It feels like a path to climb, a duel not of defeat but of discovery. In warm-up debriefs, his voice regains cadence, and the engineers lean in again, sensing that he is not echoing Marc but inventing himself anew. The crisis has not vanished, but it has shifted from paralysis to motion, and motion is the lifeblood of a racer. Pedrosa, hands tucked in his pockets, sees what he longed for in his own days but never found in time, the refusal to dissolve. The climax crystallizes in a single lap where Pecco, on compromised tires, matches Marc's sector split through a corner that had haunted him all season, and the box erupts not in triumph but in relief. The lap is not a victory. It is a resurrection, proof that he can bend without breaking. And in that fleeting instant, as engines howl and hearts pound, Bagnaia understands that the new battle is not against Marquez, nor against Ducati, but against the temptation to surrender, and the victory is that he has chosen to fight.